Nefarious forces at play of why some patients pay prices that they do. So I'm very happy to have our colleague from the School of Public Health, Dr. David Howard, here to hopefully explain some of that to us. He got his undergraduate degree from Vassar College, his PhD in 2000 from Harvard, and now is a professor in the Rollins School of Public Health. I was looking through, the internet. I found a lot of very impressive things about him. He's been widely published in New England Journal, JAMA, Circulation, and he has also a very entertaining Twitter feed. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. So working on drug prices is not something I work a whole lot on in my research, which may become apparent partway through this talk, but it's a subject I've had a lot of interest in throughout my career. Before I went to graduate school, I worked in a pharmaceutical and medical device company in Washington, D.C. It used to be called Health Technology Associates. It's now part of a major contract research organization. But one of the major topics we dealt with there was pricing of new novel products. And so I'll talk a little bit about that throughout the talk. But I was going to make a self-deprecating remark at this time about how, as a 22 and 23-year-old straight out of college who worked in a closet, I wasn't privy to a lot of boardroom conversations about drug prices. But as I was thinking about what I was going to say, I did remember that there was one instance where I did make it into a boardroom. It was the big boardroom of Merck in Pennsylvania. It's a big, long mahogany table. And we'd been hired to help Merck figure out whether to buy a company that made a artificial skin product for venous stasis ulcers. And we figured out what was the cost of existing products, which would help them know what price could they charge for the product of the company they were thinking about acquiring. And so we did our presentation. There are a few of my colleagues and then people from Merck on the other side, including someone very high up. It might have been the CEO, a lot of bigwigs. And at the end of our talk, the head of Merck looked around at our team and said, "All right, if you were in my shoes, would you buy this company?" And there was a lot of silence. And finally, his eyes rested upon me, at which point I boldly mumbled, "I'm not sure," and I looked away, and I went back to my closet. But I'm going to divide this talk up into two subjects. One is pricing branded drugs, and I'll spend most of the time on that, and then also a little bit about generics. But I think it helps to really keep those markets separate when thinking about the forces that dictate drug prices. So in the case of branded drugs, a lot of the debate that's been unfolding recently is this a market which is kind of completely free of economics, which is completely devoid of the forces we usually think about shaping prices? Economists have good tools for describing the factors that determine prices in many markets, and this is kind of an underlying basis of economics. It's something that is a core interest of economists. But in the case of branded drugs, there's a lot of debate over whether these forces matter. Is there a well-defined demand curve? Do prices respond to the value of drugs? And so in the case of branded drugs, there are a couple aspects of the market that are very unique. Each is not unique in isolation, but put together, they make a big difference. So the first is that government restricts entry via patents. So for any branded drug, the manufacturer can take out a patent which lasts 20 years. Now the manufacturers take out the patent as soon as they discover the drug. They have to wait, often cases, many years before they can start marketing it after they have approval by the FDA. And so in the pharmaceutical industry, they think in terms of effective patent length, which is the time from when the drug is initially approved by the FDA to when the patent ends. And that can vary based on how long it takes the manufacturer to get approval to run clinical trials to get FDA approval. But on average, effective patent length is about 13 years, although it can vary by quite a bit for individual drugs. So that's a 13-year period in which manufacturers have exclusive rights to the molecule. They're the only company that can sell that drug. In addition, the FDA has other provisions related to market exclusivity that limit entry by other companies that want to sell a drug. Many of these run concurrently to a patent, and so they don't really have a big impact on the period of exclusivity, but in some cases, additional FDA exclusivity periods are tacked on to the end of a patent, so that can further increase the time during which a company is a monopoly. Of course, intellectual property protections are common in a lot of markets we don't think have problems, markets we think are well-functioning, such as the market for online streaming services like Netflix, Amazon, and so forth that are protected by copyrights. So this is not a distinguishing feature of pharmaceutical markets, but it is an important one. Another feature of pharmaceutical markets, though, which is not common to other markets where intellectual property protections are common, is that there's a separation between payment and decision makers. That is, the people who are deciding whether to use products, physicians and patients, are not the ones paying for it. And so this really kind of adds another layer of complexity in the market. It really changes the way that pharmaceutical companies think about pricing their products and the economic forces at work in determining prices. Now, of course, patients often do end up paying a substantial share of the cost of drugs out of pocket. But on average, if you look at total spending on drugs and how much of that is spent by patients, patients only spend about 14%, or drug costs are, out-of-pocket drug costs are only 14% of the total spending on pharmaceutical products. And that's gone down over time. So this is a slide that shows the share of pharmaceutical spending from various payers. The purple line is Medicare, and then the sharp increase around 2006 represents the introduction of Medicare Part D. The top blue line is private, but the one that's most salient here is the green line that shows the share of pharmaceutical spending incurred by consumers out of pocket. And as you can see, it's been going down since 2000. So in some of my work, I've looked at pricing of new anti-cancer drugs. Pharmaceutical companies typically make decisions about what to price a drug, about what price to set, shortly before or right after FDA approval. The decision is both a little bit of art, a little bit of science. Pharmaceutical companies, when deciding what price to set for a drug, will look at the prices of existing products. They'll look at the prices of alternative therapies for the same condition. They'll typically commission a number of surveys, both of insurance company medical directors, physicians, and in some cases patients. These surveys will ask a number of questions about physicians and physicians' likely adoption of products, but they're all really trying to get at how sensitive are physicians to the price of the drug? How will that affect their decision about whether or not to adopt it? And the same thing is true on the medical director side. They're trying to ask insurance company medical directors, how will the price of this drug influence your decision to cover it? And if you cover it, what restrictions you impose on it? And when I worked at the pharmaceutical consulting company in my closet, part of my job was calling up medical directors and try to sound them out about their likelihood of covering new products. And one thing that really made an impression upon me is that almost without fail, when presented with a new product, their answer was the same. It was so often the same that I almost felt like this exercise of calling them up was kind of worthless. Their answer was always, if it's approved by the FDA, we will cover it. End of story. Now, some of them, when you told them specifications of the product or its likely price, would moan, grumble, complain. But in terms of their actual action, it was always, yes, we're going to cover it. And it just struck me in that environment, what pushback did drug companies ever face? If insurers, the ones who are paying for the product, are going to make decisions that do not reflect the company's, the drug price, if the drug price doesn't influence their decision-making, then drug companies have a lot of power to set their products. And I think we've seen that in the market for new anti-cancer drugs. So together with co-authors Peter Bach, Rena Conti, and Ernie Burnt, we looked at prices of newly approved anti-cancer drugs. So we were looking here at their launch prices, not the prices that may have changed after the product was approved. So these are the prices that are set immediately following FDA approval. And one nice aspect of this market, at least for studying drug prices, is that there's a fairly common standard for measuring the benefit of these drugs, which is either life expectancy or progression-free life expectancy. And so we can do more of an apples-to-apples comparison in this market versus other therapeutic areas where it's more difficult to compare quality or effectiveness between drugs. And so in this case, we computed the price for an additional life year gained based on the results reported in some cases in phase 3 trials. In the cases of drugs approved on the basis of single-arm studies, we looked at post-approval modeling studies conducted by Britain's National Institute for Clinical Effectiveness or other bodies. And so we tried to come up with a measure of kind of benefit standardized price. How much is the consumer paying for a life year? And what we found is, though there's a lot of variation at a single point in time, if you look over a fairly long period, prices are ticking upward. A drug that's approved today would have cost much less had it been approved 10 or 20 years ago, even though it's the same drug. Our analysis stopped in 2014. If we were to extend this out today, there's some drugs coming on the market that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, much more expensive than any of the products in our sample here. And so in this market, I have a feeling what's going on, and there's been a lot of writing to this effect, that when trying to decide what price to set for a product, there's really no pushback that companies face from setting a high price in the traditional sense of the word. If General Motors or Ford or an auto company sets a high price for a car, they're not going to sell a lot of it. In this case, however, decisions about which drugs to use are made by physicians, and physicians do not pay the cost. And in fact, this is a bit of a peculiarity to oncology. In some cases, physicians personally make more money when they prescribe more expensive drugs. Patients in some cases may face high co-payments, but many are shielded by insurance. Insurance companies, at least on the private side, had out-of-pocket maximums, which shield patients from the extra cost or incremental cost of drugs. It matters not to them whether a drug costs $50,000 or $100,000, they're going to pay the same thing. And to the extent that consumers do face any residual cost, drug companies have cleverly figured out how to refund some of that cost in the form of copay coupons or rebate programs that shift all of the cost onto insurers. Insurance companies, of course, would like to push back here, I think, but oncology is a market where they are somewhat reluctant to interfere in drug choices. It's a sensitive market. They don't want to engender any negative publicity. But this is the result of that dynamic. Steadily increasing prices when companies have a new drug, they try to do all the traditional studies that inform pricing in pharmaceuticals and other markets, but I have a feeling at the end of the day, their analysis comes down to looking at the prices of previously approved products and adding 10%. Now, oncology is a bit of an outlier, but the same dynamic has happened in other markets as well. And so I was kind of struck by this commentary in the New England Journal of Medicine that talked about adoption and costs for anti-diabetic medications. And they write, whether each incremental innovation is worth the price we pay in a world where insulin remains unaffordable to many patients with diabetes is less certain. What's surprising is that the trailing edge of old insulin products did not generate a market for generic competition, but rather became a set of obsolete products that were promptly removed from the U.S. market. So in an environment where physicians show great propensity to rapidly adopt new products, regardless of the cost, even if they're only a little bit more beneficial than what they replaced, the upshot is that drug companies have a tremendous amount of pricing power in that environment. Which is not to say their pricing power is unlimited, or that when faced with pushback, they can continue to set prices as they did before. So in one particularly notable instance, there's a company that came out with a drug called ziv-aflibercept, which was marketed as a competitor, or was a competitor for bevacizumab as a treatment for metastatic colorectal cancer. The company set the price of the drug about twice the price of bevacizumab. It wasn't really clear whether this was intentional or someone made a mistake in calculating the widely used dose of bevacizumab. Nevertheless, three prominent physicians at Memorial Sloan Cancer Center, one of the major cancer centers in the U.S., wrote an editorial in the New York Times where they said, this product costs too much, we're not going to use it. A couple weeks later, the company came back and cut the price in half, which I think is interesting. It just shows how arbitrary the price was to begin with, but it also is a testament to how, when faced with physician feedback, companies have to lower their prices. In this case, I think the reaction of the company was both a reaction to being embarrassed on the pages of the New York Times, but I think they were truly concerned that if 3 prominent physicians at Memorial Sloan Kettering took the lead and said, we're not going to use this product, that would spill over and influence the decisions of other oncologists at other cancer centers and even in community oncology that would limit the uptake of their drug, and so they had to respond. Of course, in most cases, it's not physicians who are the ones doing pushing back. Of course, there's a general sense and growing sense of unease among physicians about drug prices, but for the most part, it's unclear that they have made dramatic changes to the way they prescribe drugs based on prices. What has changed a little bit is the willingness of insurers to push back. So in the case of new anti-cholesterol drugs, PCSK9 inhibitors, it's an expensive class of new anti-cholesterol drugs. These drugs, it was thought, would have a very large share of the market, but they're really only beneficial for a certain subset of patients with high cholesterol. And here, insurers have really been active in trying to limit uptake of these drugs. They require physicians to get prior authorization and to submit additional documentation if they want to prescribe these drugs, which of course is a huge pain for physicians, but what it means is that then the insurers or pharmacy benefit managers can go to the drug companies and say, all right, we're going to put all these restrictions on your drug. We're going to make it a pain for patients to get. We're going to make it a pain for physicians every time they prescribe this drug. But if you give us a discount, maybe some of these restrictions will go away. And that's exactly what has happened. The companies that make these drugs are now selling them at deep discounts compared to when they were launched. Of course, this raises a dilemma of, when we think about drug prices, what is the right price? If anything, over time, despite the push for price transparency in healthcare, it's become more difficult to tell what does a drug actually cost. And so there's a schematic that the Kaiser Family Foundation put together to explain drug prices. I don't expect anyone to read this. I just put it up here to illustrate how complex it is. But increasingly over time, there's been separation between the price that a patient pays for a drug, the price that insurers pay, and the price that a drug company actually receives. And a lot of this, particularly in the final 2 instances, is driven by the practice of discounting. That is, a manufacturer will set a top-line list price and then negotiate with insurance companies steep discounts that are refunded, but in a way that leaves the patient price unchanged. And so you can see this with, I believe this is Amgen's drug, entanercept, for rheumatoid arthritis. Usually data on discounts is kept confidential. Any discounts or rebates our companies are not supposed to disclose them, but in this case somehow data was available. And so the top line shows the list price here, the red line. This is if you go online or if you're a patient at a pharmacy paying out of pocket, this is the price that is relevant. But Amgen has also granted discounts to some insurers and for this drug because it is now a somewhat competitive market for rheumatoid arthritis. There are multiple products on the market. And so the blue line is a better reflection of kind of the net price here, the price net of discounts. And as you can see, there's growing separation between the two. And so what happens is increasingly negotiations between insurers, pharmacy benefit managers, and pharmaceutical companies take place over discounts, not the list prices. This is not necessarily a bad outcome. There are still savings to be had. It just affects to whom do the savings flow, who gets to keep the savings. When drug companies negotiate over discounts, the savings flow to insurers and pharmacy benefit managers, and then ultimately, one would hope, into the pockets of people who pay insurance premiums. But they don't flow to patients whose co-payments, co-insurance, and deductibles are based on the top-line list price of the product. Now, I'm not sure drug companies are actually too happy with this state of affairs. They would probably prefer to cut prices if they're going to give a discount. So if they're going to give a discount, they would probably prefer that money go to patients. They would ideally like a situation where insurers are paying a lot and patients are paying very little. But insurance companies and pharmaceutical benefit managers have said that employers prefer to keep any discounts in the form of lower management fees or lower premiums rather than savings passed on to patients. So now switching attention to generics. So the generic market is one where traditionally the thought has been this is a very well-functioning market. This is, if branded pharmaceuticals is kind of an extreme case where you have patent protection, monopolies, separation between payment and decisions about use, kind of all the things that make markets not work well, that make it more difficult to kind of predict where prices end up, that divorce prices from value even to a greater degree than exists elsewhere in the healthcare system. The thinking was generics is a market that works well. There's competition. You have companies selling basically interchangeable products. And as a result, this is not the problematical area in the healthcare sector, although that thinking has changed a little bit over time now. But in general, recent data indicate that overall the generic market continues to function well. The green line represents a price index for generic drugs. The top line is a price index for branded drugs. But you can see prices of generic drugs have been trending downward over time. And as soon as a generic drug hits the market, that is, as soon as a branded drug loses protection, the branded drug prices in that market tend to fall very rapidly. Not necessarily for the branded drug, but prices for generic follow-on drugs they're priced at a steep discount to the price of the pre-patent expiration price of the branded drug. So prices drop by over 75%. Also, insurers have become much more adept at trying to steer patients away from branded drugs to generic drugs. So generic drugs gain market share much more rapidly than they used to. So this slide shows the market share of branded drugs following patent expiration, and the lines here each represent different time periods. So the top line represents drugs that experienced generic entry between 1999 and 2000. So in that case, 12 months after patent expiration, on average, the branded drug still was able to command a 50% share of the market. Today, however, represented by the lower line, which covers drugs that lost patent protection between 2013 and 2014, the branded drug, 12 months after generic entry, will have less than a 20% market share. So again, pharmacy benefit managers and insurers are much more active about steering patients to branded drugs. And then the FDA, and this represents more of a recent uptake, so these data cover 2014 to 2015, has signaled that it wants to be much more active about encouraging and reducing review times for generic applications. The FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb has said this is one of the priorities for his tenure at the FDA. And so the number of generic drugs that are being approved by the FDA has gone up over time, especially in the last couple of years. And Scott Gottlieb recently said, I believe it was yesterday or a couple of days ago, this is going to be a continuing area of focus, both for traditional generic drugs as well as biosimilars. He wants to reduce the time from when a branded product loses patent protection to when there's competition in the market. But looking at averages in the generic market can obscure some interesting patterns. So this slide shows the number of generic entrants for drugs that lost patent protection by the size of the market. So you see for markets that are medium to large size. So in this case, the black bar refers to drug markets where sales are greater than $1 billion. And then each bar represents a smaller market size, where the white bar represents markets where sales are less than 100 million. The interest of generic manufacturers in entering a market depends a lot on the market size. So for drugs that have serve medium to large markets, there are a lot of generic firms that enter. But for small market drugs, not so much. And so what has become increasingly apparent is that there are a lot of small market old drugs where there may only be one or two generic manufacturers who are exercising the rights to manufacture that drug. Typically, there may be other companies that have the right, that have gained FDA approval to sell the drug, but they're not exercising their right. They're not actually physically manufacturing the drug. And so if you have a market where there may be only one or two companies making the drug, and if there are two companies, maybe one of them runs into trouble, decides to stop making the drug, it runs into manufacturing trouble, suddenly you're back to the case where you have a monopoly, and so you kind of combine that with the fact that there's an increasingly large group of companies or investors who are looking for opportunities like this, who are looking for cases where there's only one generic drug manufacturer in a market. They figure what that is, buy the rights to the drug, and then jack up the price. That has led to a lot of negative publicity for the generic drug industry and a lot of headlines. I don't think this, I think this is certainly a problem for some individual patients who have to pay for these drugs. That said, I think a lot of these stories are probably better headlines than they are reflections on the health of the generic drug industry or the drug industry overall. They're notable. They've gained attention mainly because they're exceptions to the rule. So in terms of talking about policies to address drug prices, a number of policies have been proposed recently, and these fall into various categories. I'd say a lot of the policies that are discussed today I'd put in the realm of symbolic policies. That is, there are things that might make people think they are taking on big pharma. There are things that might get good headlines, but at the end of the day, they're unlikely to have a substantial impact on drug price levels. These include drug price transparency laws that are under consideration in many states. So these are laws that would require drug companies to report out information on how much they spent to develop a drug, how much they spend on marketing, so on and so forth. Giving Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices, another law which would probably be largely symbolic and unlikely to have a major impact on drug prices because the private plans that currently insure beneficiaries under Medicare Part D already have the power to negotiate drug prices, except in a few cases when Medicare has explicitly told them that they can't negotiate. So that's a case where it would probably be more advantageous, it would probably be more effective to reduce prices, to remove the restrictions on the private Part D plans than to shift the locus of negotiating authority to the federal government. Some drug companies are pushing the idea of outcomes contingent pricing. They'll say, well, we'll price our drug at X dollars for if it works, but we'll give a rebate or a discount if it doesn't work. There again, I don't see drug companies giving up substantial pricing power. They're going to structure those contracts in a way that leaves them with the same amount or more revenue. A policy that would be effective, but also potentially harmful, is having the government expropriate the patent rights from drug companies to be able to buy and make the drug for a lower price. The federal government in the United States has this power. It's called march-in rights, and there has been some discussion recently over whether they should exercise that for drugs used to treat hepatitis C. And in other countries, they're having similar discussions about whether the company should kind of take control of the drug and sell it for a lower price. I worry a little, so this is certainly going to be effective in lowering the price, but we might worry a little bit about what's the side effect in this case, what's the collateral damage. When drug companies see that a company that makes a very effective drug for an infectious disease is being subject to criticism and potentially losing their ability to charge whatever they want for the drug, it's going to make them think twice about developing any drugs that serve large kind of markets with public payers or that address public health issues like hepatitis C. And so you do worry a little bit about the chilling effect here on research and development. There are some policies, I think, that might be better off in terms of kind of broaching the trade-off between having low prices today versus promoting incentives for research and development in the future. So one would be to allow Medicaid and Medicare plans more authority to exclude drugs from coverage and to subject drugs with high costs but relatively low value to additional restrictions. So currently, the federal government requires all Medicaid programs to cover basically all drugs. Medicaid programs can subject drugs to prior authorization requirements, but at the end of the day, they have to pay for them. Massachusetts Medicaid and then more recently Arizona's Medicaid programs have requested permission from the federal government to be able to say that we're simply not going to cover certain drugs. If there are multiple drugs that are equally effective in treating the same condition, then we reserve the right to, or we want the right to exclude from coverage the more effective drugs. They also want the right to be able to exclude from coverage or potentially have more room to negotiate prices for drugs that are approved on the basis of less than solid evidence. So drugs are approved on the basis of single-arm trials or surrogate endpoints, where it's not really clear if the drug works, but it's much more expensive than existing therapeutic options. If Medicaid could exercise these rights, they would have much greater ability to negotiate lower prices. Recent indications are that the Trump administration is not going to grant these waivers. They're not going to grant requests from Medicaid to be able to charge lower, to be able to exclude drugs. It's not, one never knows how much of this is kind of they're getting pushback from the pharmaceutical industry that's motivating the Trump's administration opposition versus simply the fact that they're concerned about the legality in light of previous legislation that has restricted the ability of Medicaid to exclude drugs from coverage. In the United States, it's uncommon to tie coverage of new drugs or products to cost effectiveness, but increasingly, I think insurers are looking at cost effectiveness when they're deciding how tightly to cover or how many restrictions to impose on new drugs. There is a research institute at Tufts that routinely now calculates cost effectiveness for new drugs. I think increasing attention to cost effectiveness and basing coverage decisions on cost effectiveness will definitely help lower drug prices and better align drug prices with value. However, unless insurers are ultimately willing to say no, unless they're ultimately willing to say, we are not going to cover this drug, it's too expensive, it's very hard for them to gain additional leverage to reduce drug prices. So I'd just like to close with a few kind of general thoughts or comments. These are questions I don't necessarily have the answer to, but I think they're helpful for thinking about the issues we've talked about today and policies related to drug prices. So if you read a lot of public debate about new drugs or some of the older generic drugs, often it's framed in terms of the question, are drug prices too high? Is this price too high? And there's not really a scientific way to determine when is a drug price too high. There's simply no standard. So I think a perhaps more productive question to ask might be, in the case where a drug creates value, either in the form of cost savings or in the form of improved health, what is a fair division or fair separation of that value between drug company shareholders versus patients, insurers, and insurance people who buy insurance, premium policyholders? In the case of HIV drugs approved since the 1980s, drug companies, according to one estimate, were only able to capture about 5% of the value created by those drugs. Now, there may be some unique features of the HIV market that limited their pricing power, but as a general point, it's important to remember that in the case of branded drugs, companies are able to charge a high price, but only for a limited time period, about 12 years on average. After that, society, patients, insurers get their drug from the end of the patent expiration until the end of time without having to pay monopoly prices. And so although companies can charge high prices, their pricing power is limited temporally by the length of patents. Another question is, should we sacrifice future innovation for lower prices today by reducing patent length? A lot of the debate over drug prices has proceeded as if there's no relationship between the prices companies are able to charge and innovation and research and development. Yet there are studies to suggest that when companies can earn higher profits, they invest more in research and development. So there is a trade-off between drug companies' prices and innovation. Now, it may be that we think that companies are innovating in ways that don't ultimately add a lot of value. They're developing products that are only marginal improvements on what came before, yet charging much higher prices. So that's certainly a fair criticism, but there is a trade-off between drug company profits and innovation, and discussions about policies to reduce drug company prices should recognize that trade-off. And one way to think about it again is, are we willing to pare back patent lengths to have cheaper drug prices, even if that means sacrificing future innovation? Another question is, are high prices here really the problem, or is it the lack of apparent relationship between prices and value? I think that the discussion and debate over drug prices has kind of proceeded along both tracks. In some cases, people are just simply say prices are too high. In other cases, though, unease seems to reflect the fact that in some markets, there doesn't seem to be a tight relationship between the additional clinical benefits to patients and the prices that drug companies are able to charge. Another question, is there a way to reduce prices for patients without giving drug companies additional leverage to increase prices? So a lot of the debate over drug prices has focused on the prices that patients pay, ignoring the fact that there is a relationship between what patients pay and what drug companies are able to charge as the top-line price. And as patients' out-of-pocket costs decrease, as the relationship between patients' willingness to take a drug and the top-line price that a drug company charges is diminished, drug companies gain additional leverage to increase prices in that case. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that any interventions to reduce patients' out-of-pocket costs may well give drug companies additional pricing power, and that will increase costs to insurers. And finally, although we've talked about some unique features of the pharmaceutical market, namely that there is patent protection for branded drugs, many of the criticisms leveled at the pharmaceutical industry seem somewhat applicable or equally applicable to other facets of the healthcare system in terms of a lack of relationship between prices and value, having higher prices here than in other countries, and so on and so forth. And that's all I've got to say, but I'm looking forward to questions.
Well, it's very enlightening. There's a lot to learn there. The thing I've been impressed with, just personal experience, is the encounter we're having with the PCSK9 drugs, and just try to get those in the patient's hands. It is a massive amount of paperwork that I'd never seen before, and I'm glad you kind of enlightened me as to how that is working and why it's working that way. We'll open it for questions here if you'll have any. While they go ahead.
Maybe I could just copy and repeat it for you. I've heard in the news that there's some large employers that are beginning to kind of self-insure their workers, and I wondered if you think that was going to become a bigger trend and how that would affect kind of costs and drug prices.
Sure. So the question is, are employers starting to self-insure? So I mean, most large employers like Emory are already self-insured, although they run all their health insurance benefits through major carriers like Aetna. So you're talking about instances where the employers are actually kind of starting to operate insurance. Yeah, I think that's going to be kind of unlikely. To set up a network of physicians and providers is very expensive, And so it's much easier for a company like Coca-Cola or Delta to just buy into an existing network, especially when you have, instead of having all your employees concentrated in one area, all your employees are spread among different areas. So I don't know that that's really going to pick up steam, although you certainly are seeing more efforts with companies like Walmart and Amazon to try to make forays into healthcare that may eventually affect the way their employees receive benefits.
CMS and Medicare having the right to negotiate, which they don't currently have, or Medicaid and Medicare. I guess I've come up through the VA system where there's a national formulary, and I have always assumed that that was a cost savings and a significant one, but you seem to have referenced that you think that might be a false sense of savings if we were to allow the same thing with CMS, and maybe there's some nuanced differences that you could discuss.
Okay, sure. So private insurers that serve Part D beneficiaries, of course, are already able to negotiate over some drug prices, not others. So there are certain so-called protected classes, including antidepressants and anti-cancer drugs, where companies that serve Medicare beneficiaries have to cover all drugs in those classes. So they can't go to a manufacturer and say, you give us a discount or we're going to cover your competitor's drug, not yours. So they immediately lose any negotiating power over the drugs in those classes. For the remaining drugs, they can negotiate. So the question there is, would the Medicare program be able to obtain additional discounts on top of those that the private companies are already able to negotiate? And they probably would in some instances, although I have a feeling the dollar values of those discounts would probably be somewhat small because we're mostly talking about drugs that are probably off patent or face many close competitors. I think ultimately the ability to really wring significant savings from the pharmaceutical industry hinges on the ability to say no. The willingness of, so in this case it would be, is Medicare willing to say no, we're not going to cover that drug, it's too expensive. I'm not sure how it works in the VA system. I gather they have a relatively open formulary. But in the case of Medicare, okay, they don't. In the case of Medicare, based on the history of Medicare coverage decisions, both for drugs as well as other medical devices and other procedures, tests, and so forth, there's very little or no history of Medicare denying coverage based on price or cost. And so I just don't think that's a credible threat that Medicare will be able to exercise.
A couple of questions I'd like to ask. One is, besides the obvious television ads and newspaper ads, how else are they steering patients from generic to the brand names? And can you follow up with that?
Right. So, I mean, insurers have made increasingly stark gradations in their copayment levels so that if a patient wants to pay the least amount out of pocket for a drug, they have to use the generic. Pharmaceutical companies have tried to subvert this by giving patients coupons or copays that refund patients out-of-pocket costs when they use branded drugs. Insurers are unhappy about this arrangement, and it's in many therapeutic markets the rebates from drug companies are small. There are limits on how far drug companies can take this, but in some cases drug companies are essentially bribing patients to use the branded drug, which makes patients better off but leaves insurers footing the bill for a much higher branded price. But again, going back to this slide, I mean, insurers are getting increasingly wily about driving patients away from branded drugs. And so the ability of companies manufacturing branded drugs that have lost patent protection to kind of maintain their pricing and maintain their profits is really eroding.
How good is the quality control on a generic drug production?
Right. That I don't know. One issue in the debate over the prices of some generic drugs and drug shortages and the ability of some generic drug manufacturers to actually act as monopolists and kind of commandeer a market for at least a temporary time before another company enters. A lot of that debate hinges on how stringent our FDA regulations to open up a new generic drug plant? Are they too restrictive? Are they unnecessarily limiting entry? It's not an area I know a whole lot about, but I mean, that's certainly an area of discussion.
Thanks. In an academic place like this or in private practice or something, it seems that physicians are pretty powerless against any of these forces. It seems like they're more at a policy level than at an individual level. So other than things like antibiotic stewardship, stopping medicines when they're not needed, stopping ineffective medicines, evidence-based medicine, things like that, I feel like we are essentially doing nothing and maybe hurting the problem when we prescribe expensive medications. We essentially steer patients towards coupons and rebates, which are fueling the problem. So is there any role other than isolated occurrences like the Memorial Sloan Kettering example where an academic institution or providers can play any role in this fight?
Right. So, I mean, to the extent that large health systems, it doesn't matter whether it's academic or non-academic, are a little bit more purposeful about what they prescribe and try to guide physicians' prescribing decisions in a way that takes cost into consideration, then that will have a ripple effect and limit drug companies' pricing power. So I know like endocrinology at Emory is having an initiative to try to help primary care physicians figure out which of the now many anti-diabetic drugs are appropriate and when does it make sense to use one of the newer, more expensive classes versus when is older, somewhat less expensive product safe. And to the extent that it takes cost into consideration, that will have a ripple effect. Of course, it used to be the case from the perspective of a provider like Emory, they have no incentive to take price into account. That's starting to change. Emory's contract with private insurers are starting to reward more cost-conscious behavior.
We'll get to change and turn off the mic.
Yeah, so, it used to be the case that Emory had little reason to worry about the cost of drug product prices that its physicians prescribed, but now that's starting to change. Emory has contracts now that give it some incentive to try to limit costs. I don't know to what extent those contracts are written in a way that drug prices are considered when calculating cost of care. I suspect in some cases they're excluded, but that's starting to change. There are a number of health systems now that are selling insurance. That certainly is going to change how they view drug prices.
Any other questions? Yes.
On your last slide, I think it was the second question you asked, whether or not we should sacrifice future innovation for lower prices today by reducing patent length. I was wondering what you thought about the following kind of argument for that. So in general, it looks like our health outcomes are improving over time, right? So if we had to predict on a population level, on average, we'll be better off. People 10 years from now will be better off, 20 years, so on, right? So in a way, we're the worst off health-wise group, right? Especially in developed countries like this. So that might give us some reason to prioritize us now over future generations because they're already going to be receive all sorts of other kind of health improvements and other interventions.
Sure.
I think that's a good argument.
Although we're bequesting them a large federal deficit, so we're kind of screwing them over that way. But another way to think about it, suppose our forefathers is not necessarily the right word, but suppose 30 years ago or 20 years ago they had this discussion and they said, you know what, we think we are at a good place in terms of pharmaceutical innovation. We just want the products that are available today to be cheap, and we won't worry so much about development of future products in the next 20 years. Would that have been a good decision to make in retrospect?
Chloe, thank you. Again, it's very enlightening. Still got a lot of questions about this. And clearly, our cost of medical care today is non-sustainable, and this is part of it, and we've got to figure out some of these things. Appreciate you giving us some guidance.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. Thank you.